Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Dharma at Snowy River Zen Center. I hope you're enjoying the weather. It's very nice weather that kind of belies our name as the snow is quickly melting and disappearing already. Early March. It's almost in the 60s. But tonight, or today, while I was at work, I had the thought to offer teaching on famous part of Dogen's Genjo Koan. Genjo Koan is probably the most famous of Dogen's fascicles. This quintuplet, this 5 lines from Dogen's Genjo Koan, is considered a very concise and deep and comprehensive expression of his understanding of Zen practice, Buddhist practice. And so I had this thought this morning, hey, let's talk about that. And then I got home and I got a little anxious, a little nervous to presume to offer words on such a text. But here goes, I'm going to do it anyway. And if I fall on my face, I fall on my face. And hopefully you'll be kind and forgiving towards my failure. I'm bound to fail, so. Anyway, the 4 lines from Genjo Koan are as follows. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things. When actualized by the myriad things, your body and mind, as well as the bodies and minds of others, drop away. No trace of realization remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. Those are the 5 lines. And they're, as I said, they're considered to be the most simultaneously concise and comprehensive at the same time. Concise and comprehensive expression of the entirety of Zen practice. To study the Buddha way, is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things. When actualized by the myriad things, your body and mind, as well as the bodies and minds of others, drop away. No trace of realization remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. So those are the 5 lines. What the heck do they mean? And you could spend a long time contemplating these lines and getting a deeper and deeper appreciation of them. The practice remains forever radically simple. We've been talking about it for some time now. Think, not thinking. The practice is radically simple. Forget about yourself and just sit and feel your breathing. And we'll talk more about that. So you can contemplate the implications of these 5 lines, study them philosophically, analytically, meditate on them. And what they reveal is a deepening of the appreciation of the expansiveness that comes from think, not thinking, dropping thought, stepping outside of the stream of perpetual thinking, prapanka. You know, what that simple effort, which doesn't change, in some ways it stays radically simple. You just drop preoccupations and taste the tea. Hear the bird. You know, Get out of your thinking, get out of your discursive mind, and just appreciate this moment. That's Zen practice. It doesn't change much. That's basically it from kindergarten to PhD. That's the effort we make. You know, the nature of the effort remains radically the same and radically simple. I'm not saying easy, but radically simple. Dogen expressed it as think, not thinking. Suzuki Roshi, in his description, talks about forget about yourself and just sit and feel your breathing. That's all. Just feel this breath as it arises, this arising breath as it is right now. But the implications of such a simple practice are vast. And that's the theme of these 5 verses. And what I'm going to attempt to stumble through tonight. So I've got a few pages of notes and a couple of books up here as resources. My first resource, however, is something that I saw this evening on Facebook. Somebody, I don't know who, I didn't look up to see if it was somebody I knew or not, posted the following. My superpower? Question mark. You want to know what my superpower is? I can look you dead in the eye. No, pardon me. I can look at you dead in the face while you are talking and not hear a damn word you said. See, one of the disadvantages of doing this via Zoom is I can't tell if you're chuckling. So I don't get the feedback to see if, you know, whether or not you're activating your superpower, not hearing what I'm saying. But I found that humorous. My superpower, I can look you dead in the face while you are talking and not hear a damn word you said. Well, I contemplated that and I came to the conclusion that there's a lot of superheroes in the world. You know, there's a lot of folks that can do that. I can do that. I catch myself doing it with Jacob sometimes. You know, he'll be talking, my mind will be someplace else, and I feel that, I see that, and I make an effort to turn off my superpower and pay attention. So that's one thing I saw on Facebook this evening. This morning, and I think this is the verbiage. I tried to scroll down and find it, but it's buried down deep in the past of Facebook. And I think it was a friend. I think it was Andrea Levine that posted this one, but I couldn't confirm that. And the following was posted. The quieter I become, the more I can hear. Quite simple, right? The quieter I become, of course, the more I can hear. If I'm making a lot of noise, you know, either internally or externally, you know, clashing pots and pans in the kitchen, or just, you know, spinning with thinking, you know, I can't hear the birds singing. I can't hear the traffic that's happening right now on Main Street. And the quieter I become, the more I can hear. You know, it's hard to dispute that. You know, it's very simple concept. And you can verify it in experience. You know, if you get really, really quiet, you can hear this hum, the lights, and a horn just happened on Main Street. And the thing that I'd like you to consider is there actually is no limit to how quiet you can become. I feel that. I feel that through, as a result of my decades of Zen practice, that just when I thought I'd really attained some deep level of concentration and stillness of mind, I stumbled upon something that was deeper, something that was more still, more quiet. And, you know, I've been trying to sell this to you for some years now, that When you sit in meditation, there's no limit to how physically relaxed you can become, doing the body scan. And there's no limit to how quiet your mind can become. And if you explore that possibility, that can be a source of enthusiasm and faith for continuing your effort. It doesn't mean that it's under your control, that tomorrow you will decide to get quieter, because it may not happen. But still, even though it may not happen tomorrow, there's a fundamental fact that there's no limit to how quiet you can become. And I find that very encouraging. So there's this phrase called deep listening. So we're talking about how quiet we can become in order so we can hear. That's the meme or the quote that was on Facebook this morning. The quieter I become, the more I can hear. Quite simple, really. As practice, it's quite simple. Not easy, but the practice is simple. The world's practice reveals are limitless, but the practice remains radically simple, as is the practice of deep listening. The deep listening is the term I heard years ago. When you're listening to someone and your job is just to listen, to take in what they're saying, who they are, the nature of their being in that moment, without interpretation, without sage advice, without criticism. You just empty yourself of all those things and just listen. And we actually, in communication workshops we had at Gringos Farm, we did this practice, and people were given a topic about themselves or about something to speak on, and another person was given a task of just listening. And it takes a certain kind of effort, because as you're listening, something they may say may trigger a thought or a reaction. And there's this pull, a temptation to elaborate that thought or that reaction or that interpretation or that criticism, that sage advice. You can feel your mind, your attention going towards what you thought instead of what they're saying. And if you're practicing, you can see that happening. You can study that and turn back, empty yourself of that. Empty yourself of that intention, that impulse, and return to just listening, emptying yourself, forgetting about yourself, radically forgetting about yourself, and just listening to that person. And the theory behind this practice of deep listening, and I use the word theory, but it's actually a fact, I feel, from my experience of both doing and receiving this kind of listening, is that people feel something happens to the person who's being attended to so deeply. Something wells up within them where they feel affirmed. And they find themselves able to say things that surprise themselves, that surprises themselves. And so this empty listening, this deep listening, has a fascinating dynamic quality to it. It can promote affirmation and healing without any sage advice, just that kind of deep presence, empty yourself of self-preoccupation and just attending to the speaker. So this is the kind of emptying yourself, the kind of forgetting yourself. And that second line in Dogen's quintuplet, those 5 lines, is to study the self is to forget the self. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. So in that practice of deep listening, both are happening. you study yourself. Am I simply attending? Or am I thinking about what to say in response to what they're saying? And so you see the arising of the self in the form of a critical thought about what they're saying, or an insight that you think could really help them, or the mind wandering to something else, not really interested in what they're saying. You see a certain configuration of the self arise. And if you see that, and if you're committed to the practice of the Buddha way, you forget that and you empty yourself. And by virtue of seeing the self arise, you have the opportunity to forget it. In Dogen's phraseology, he doesn't say first you study the self and then you forget the self. He said that his phraseology seems to me to indicate that this is something that's simultaneous. All five of these are simultaneous. They happen on the moment. They're happening on the moment. Studying the self in this way is forgetting the self, is to de-identify with the discursive mind that we tend to habitually identify with. So deep listening is an example of these first two lines, to study yourself. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. Studying the self is forgetting the self. When you're on point, when you're in the moment, making endeavor in the way. In Christianity, there's this Greek word, kenosis. Kenosis. It comes from something that I think one of the epistle writers said about Jesus, that Jesus came with the fullness of God, but did not, I didn't look it up, so I don't have the words right at hand, but he came with the fullness of God, but he did not take it a matter of pride to be God, but emptied himself as a man, even to his death on the cross. And kenosis is that word empty. He emptied himself to be the sacrificial lamb in that case. So that's the first instance that I know of. And I'm not a New Testament scholar, so I could be wrong, but it's a Greek word that appeared in the New Testament in reference to Jesus. And later, especially with the Desert Fathers, became a praxis, where, prayer of silence, prayer like the Jesus prayer, you do a mantra to empty yourself of discursive thought, as we Zen students endeavor to do. And that prayer of either radical silence or reducing discursive activity to the mantra as a way of breaking through prapanka, the proliferation of thinking, by saying, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner, who's the Jesus prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy upon me, a sinner. That was the Jesus prayer. And in practice, it can be shortened to Lord, or Lord Jesus, or mercy. And the Desert Fathers in early Christian monasticism, and today, I forget the name of Cistercian monk who writes about it a lot. Almost had it. A friend of Thomas Merton's, but he writes about contemplative prayer in Christianity. But the contemplative prayer in Christianity is centered around this notion of kenosis, self-emptying, self-forgetting. And what's interesting to me, and an important point, is that this doesn't involve violence towards the ego. It's not like you have to beat yourself up. It's not flagellating yourself, or as Mary Albert says, you don't have to walk miles across the desert repenting. It's a simple forgetting. Once again, it's radically simple. You don't have to deconstruct the self. You don't have to abuse the self. You just forget it. You just drop it. You just empty it. It's a simple forgetting, a simple dropping of self-preoccupation, of self-referential thinking and feeling. So this notion of forgetting the self, that's the second line in Dogen's, I'm calling it a quintuplet, because there's 5 lines. The first line is to study the Buddha way, is to study the self. The second line, to study the self, is to forget the self. Now, in Zen mind, beginner's mind, Suzuki Roshi used the phrase forget yourself several times. And I want to share with you a few of those times. The first one, whoops, the technology of Kindle. The first one I've already referenced, but I want to look at it more completely. I'm not touching this device right. It's doing fine when I was prepared. There we go. The first one comes from the section in Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind called Emptiness. It talks about concentration, samadhi, shamatha, mental stabilization. And he says concentration is not to try hard to watch something. In Zazen, in your meditation, if you try to look at one spot, you'll be tired in about 5 minutes. This is not concentration. Concentration means freedom. So that's one aspect of thinking, not thinking. It doesn't require strong exertion. It's a effortless shift in a way. To find the way to make the shift, you're kind of groping around in the dark for a while. But when you discover how to actually think, not thinking, when you discover how actually to like let go of discursive activity, it's a very simple thing to do. And in a sense, quite easy. In another sense, it's subtle. And to find the territory of that subtlety might not be so easy. But he says concentration means freedom. So it means freedom. So your effort should be directed at nothing. You should be concentrated on nothing. In Zazen practice, we say your mind should be concentrated on your breathing. But the way to keep your mind on your breathing is to forget all about yourself and just to sit and feel your breathing. Very simple. You just forget about doing it right. You forget about how much time you spent spinning in thought. You forget about how well you're doing. You just feel this breath. You just forget about yourself and just feel this breath arising right now, alive right now. In order to actually feel the breath, you have to forget about yourself, which he says. If you are concentrated on your breathing, you will forget yourself. And if you forget yourself, you'll be concentrated on your breathing. If you're really listening, you will hear the other person. If you're empty and listening, you'll hear the other person. And if you're hearing the other person, if you're really hearing the other person, you must be empty and listening. If you forget about yourself, you can feel your breathing. If you can feel your breathing, you can forget about yourself. He says, I don't know which is first. So actually, there is no need to try too hard to be concentrated on your breathing. That's the subtlety. It's hard because if you try too hard, you miss it. That's why it's hard. It's hard because it's not hard, actually. And it's elusive because it's so simple. And we think there must be more that we need to do. We need to purify ourselves somehow. We need to flagellate ourselves somehow. We need to walk across the desert repenting or something. It can't be so simple. It's just to forget about yourself and feel your breathing. There must be more to the practice. No, it's radically simple. So there's no need to try too hard to be concentrated on the breathing. Just do as much as you can. If you continue this practice, eventually you'll experience the true existence which comes from emptiness. So there, that last line leads us into the third line of Dogen's quintuplet. If you continue this practice, eventually you will experience the true existence which comes from emptiness. To study the self is to forget. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things. To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things. If you continue this practice, eventually you will experience the true existence which comes from emptiness. So that's one reference. That's the biggest reference from Suzuki Roshi about forget the self, to forget the self. And briefly, some of the others with probably less commentary. Okay, this is in the section called Mind Weeds. Strictly speaking, any effort we make is not good for our practice because it creates waves in our mind. If we try too hard to follow our breathing, we won't be able to feel it. It is impossible, however, to obtain absolute calmness of our mind without any effort. We must make some effort, but we must forget ourselves in the effort we make. In this realm, there is no subjectivity or objectivity. Our mind is just calm. So we must make some effort, but we must forget ourselves in the effort we make. So there's another reference to forget the self. So we must make effort in our practice, but it has to be selfless. It has to be of the character of kenosis, of self-emptying. It's a subtle effort. The way to just do the dishes is you forget about yourself and just do the dishes. It's quite simple. You don't have to try hard to concentrate. If you forget about yourself, the dishes come, you're actualized by the dishes. The dishes just come into their being. The true dishes are before you. You just forget about yourself in the effort that you make. And there's a dynamism to the activity which you simply behold. Mopping the floor comes into being before you. You'll experience the true existence which comes from emptiness. Things present themselves fully to you when you forget about yourself in the effort that you make. Okay. See if I want to reference this one. And we should not hoard knowledge. We should be free from our knowledge. If you collect various pieces of knowledge as a collection, it may be very good, but this is not our way. We should not try to surprise people by our wonderful treasures. We should not be interested in something special. If you want to appreciate something fully, you should forget yourself. You should accept it like a lightning flashing in the utter darkness of the sky. We should not be interested in something special. If you want to appreciate something fully, you should forget yourself. You should accept it like lightning flashing in the utter darkness of the sky. So the full appreciation requires an emptying of our self-concern or self-preoccupation. If you want to appreciate the person you're listening to fully, you forget yourself and you just listen. You just attend to that person. Then you can really hear them. If your mind is going to your interpretation of their condition, your sage advice, your criticism of how foolish they are, what have you, then you're not fully appreciating them. You're not hearing them fully because you're no longer present. So those are the references in Zen Mind Beginner's Mind about forgetting yourself. And one reference to being actualized by the myriad things. So he says, if you continue this practice of just forget about yourself and feel your breathing, just that simple thing. If you continue this practice of just sit, forget about yourself, and feel your breath, eventually you'll experience the true existence which comes from happiness. And more on that later, what that actually might mean. Mahatma Gandhi, he loved this phrase, reduce oneself to zero. Now, he said it in various ways. The first way in my memory, I couldn't find when I was doing research. I couldn't find it online anywhere. So the verbiage might not be quite what he said, but something like, there comes a time when a person becomes irresistible and their actions unlimited in their effect. And this is when he has reduced himself to zero. So there comes a time when a person becomes irresistible and his actions unlimited in their effect. This is when he has reduced himself to zero. And please excuse the male pronoun. This is Gandhi, and he's using the male pronoun pretty exclusively, as everybody did in his day for humanity. Okay, he also said, if you would swim on the bosom of the ocean of truth, you must reduce yourself to zero. I kind of like that one, the image of swimming on the bosom of the ocean of truth. Swimming on the bosom of the ocean of truth. So it's got three metaphors there, the metaphor of swimming, the metaphor of bosom, and the metaphor of ocean. Well, ocean and swimming, they're not mixing metaphors, but the bosom is kind of like a mixed metaphor, but it's poetic, so it's okay. And then the last one, I must reduce myself to zero. For so long as man, once again that male pronoun, does not of his own free will put himself last among his fellow creatures, there is no salvation for him. Ahimsa is the farthest limit of humility. I must reduce myself to zero. So long as man does not of his own free will put himself last among his fellow creatures, there is no salvation. For him, ahimsa is the farthest limit of humility. One thing about these quotes from Gandhi is they kind of feel to me like there's some struggle with the ego. You got to conquer the ego, which is, one way of conceiving of this notion of self-emptying. You have to kill the old man. That's not Zen or Buddhist understanding. Zen understanding is to see through the reification of the self that isn't really there to begin with. It's a matter of not of castigation or annihilation of something, but seeing through an illusion. Seeing that the self arises, an apparition of the self arises that has no actual substance, like a mirage. In the Uttara Tantra, that Shastra, that's a repeated metaphor for the arising of the experience of self. It arises like a mirage. Looks like there's water on the road up ahead, but there's not. It's a reflection of the clouds with disturbance in the air. And it just looks like water. And we impute water where there is no water. So there's this, we're wired to perceive this illusion of itself. And practice is to see through that illusion by forgetting it for a while and see what our experience is like when we drop self-referential mental and emotional activity for a while. What is that like? What kind of data experiential data do we receive with that letting go of the self? There's nothing to push against. And pushing against it, in a way, continues to reify it, continues to make it something, when actually there's nothing there. Which brings us to the Buddhist understanding of mind. The Buddhist understanding of mind might help us to appreciate what can be revealed in forgetting the self, in making that simple, steady effort to think, not thinking, what is beyond thinking. And this is the Prajnaparamita in 8,000 lines. One sentence. Mind itself, excuse me, change my posture. Mind itself is devoid of mind, for the nature of mind is pure light. So that's the line. Mind itself is devoid of mind, for the nature of mind is clear light, pure light, clear light. That's a very famous line in the Prajnaparamita of 8,000 lines. Prajna means wisdom. And paramita means to cross over, to reach the other shore. And there's a collection of sutras called the Prajnaparamita Sutra literature. There's the Heart Sutra, which is the Hridaya Prajnaparamita Sutra, which is one page. And then there's a sutra on one letter, which is Ah. And then there's, larger than 8,000 lines. So, so what this means? So this is, the nature of consciousness, which, still today in science is a debated issue. What is it really? And scientists, don't have a global consensus on what consciousness actually is. It seems to be something of a mystery, consciousness. So consider this. You could be conscious of a thought. You could be conscious of a sound. You could be conscious of a sight, of an emotional feeling, but you cannot be conscious of consciousness. Consciousness cannot see itself, like the eye cannot see itself and the hand cannot grasp itself. Consciousness is not a thing among things. This is a deeper teaching of selflessness, that there actually is no self, in the sense of something that is unchanging and perduring. There's just perpetual change. And this is hard to talk about, trying to find words to express this. This is the teaching of what true nature is. Nothing at all. True, this is then saying true nature is no nature. And there's a famous dialogue between Matsu and one of his disciples. Matsu, great master Ma, used to always teach, mind itself is Buddha. Mind itself is Buddha. Then later in his life, he was teaching no mind, no Buddha. And his disciple, Dame, was given Dharma transmission, went and taught, and was teaching, as he learned from his master, Matsu, mind itself is Buddha. And then one of Matsu's other disciples came and visited him and said, hey, you know what? Our master is now saying no mind, no Buddha. And Dame says, I don't care what he's saying, what that old fart is saying. I say mind itself is Buddha. The name Dame means plum, great plum, Dame. And so this disciple went back to Matsu and related this to Matsu. And Matsu said, ah, the great plum is right. So he approved of the fact that Dame says, I don't care what this old fart is saying. I teach mind itself is Buddha. So mind itself is devoid of mind. We are conscious. We can hear the sound on Main Street. We can hear the bird. We can know when we're thinking various things, but we can't see consciousness itself. So mind itself, there is consciousness. Mind itself is Buddha, and no mind, no Buddha. It's not like they're refuting one another. They're two sides of the same coin. Mind itself is devoid of light, for the nature of mind is pure light. So that's the succinct sentence in the Prajnaparamita Sutra about the ultimate nature of mind, our true nature, our Buddha nature. Fundamentally, at the inmost, most subtle, most primal level, we are simply light. We are simply awareness, nothing more, just awareness. That is our true nature, our Buddha nature, just awareness. We have a habit of obscuring it with stories, silly, sometimes toxic, sometimes horrific elaborations of concept of who we think we are, who we think they are. You know, we contort or caricaturize bare awareness with some narrative that obscures its fundamental quality of just bringing to light being. So understanding this principle of the nature of mind, the ultimate nature of mind, is how to understand that third line of the quintuplet. To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things. We drop the story, when we forget the self, the true existence, which comes from emptiness, we can experience. True being, you know, we simply reflect the cosmos. We are the cosmos coming into awareness of itself as this flower, as this bird song, as this cockroach, what have you. Whatever comes into awareness just comes into awareness. And this is always already happening. It's happening now. We simply obscure it with projections of self, with prapanka, with these mental conceptual elaborations. But consider this. We can say we have awareness of a sound. We can say we have awareness of a sight. This is something that I read from this new book I got by David Loy, titled Slack and Transcendence. Or we can say, we can have awareness of a sight or awareness as a sight. We can have awareness of a bird, awareness as a bird. We become the bird. We are the bird. We are the light playing on the Kinnickinnic River. We can be aware of it, or we can be aware as it. When there's no self to obscure it, that is our life coming into being. To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things. So I think that's David Loy's point when he says we can be aware of the light on the river, or we can be aware as the light up. That's the better way to phrase it. We can be aware of the light dancing on the river, or we can be aware as the light dancing on the river. Is there any reason to say one is false and one is true? Fundamentally, ontologically, on the level of being, You know, we can be aware, we can be aware of a thought, and we tend to think we are that thought. But simply, awareness is coming into being as a thought. That's all that's happening. But we tend to think that's me. Awareness comes into being as the light dancing on the river, but we don't think that that's us. We think that's other. So that brings us to the fourth line in the quintuplet. When being actualized by the very things, your body and mind, as well as the bodies and minds of others, drop away. And in other words, dualistic consciousness drops away, and non-duality presents itself. When we are aware as the light dancing on the river, duality drops away. And the trauma of duality, that's a whole other talk, but the trauma of being stuck in duality, that the radical exile from everything but our own tiny little self drops away. And others are liberated too, although it may not be in their awareness anymore. That's also another talk. So that's the teaching of Prajnaparamita. Mind itself is devoid of mind, because mind is simply a mirror, illuminating the cosmos, as that sound on Main Street, as whatever arises. Mind itself is devoid of mind, for the nature of mind is pure light. That's another way of looking at line 3. To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things, and also line 4. When actualized by the myriad things, subject-object drops away, and the capacity of mind simply to be awareness itself. The place where all this is, the place where the whole cosmos is coming into being is mind, which is the Dzogchen interpretation of Prajnaparamita. Dzogchen loves that line. In fact, I first encountered this line from Prajnaparamita, a book by His Holiness the Dalai Lama on Dzogchen, where he has a chapter basically commenting on this line when he's teaching Dzogchen, because the metaphor for mind in Dzogchen is space. Consciousness is the place where the cosmos is happening. That's the place of the universe. A phenomena arising and disappearing is mind, which is equivalent to space. So the last line is, for me anyway, the most difficult. No trace of realization remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. There's nothing to hang on to. No trace. You don't become some sort of different being. And yet, your actual nature is revealed to you. Like I said, this bare awareness is always already happening. We're alive. We can taste things, we can see things, we can hear things. Bare awareness is always present. It's just obscured by these clouds of prapanka, of mental proliferation. And when we think not thinking, we part the clouds a little bit. And we might have some wonderful experience, like I talked about on the seminar last Thursday. The experience is not the same as true nature, but it pertains to true nature. So no trace of realization remains. You don't become a Buddha is just a person. You don't become a different kind of person. No trace of realization remains. And this no trace continues endlessly. When you realize you're nothing at all, you never have been. You're just awareness, aware of itself. the more you can actually touch this quality of our human nature. My experience has been, as I've said before, that the fear of death is mitigated for me. I won't claim that I've abolished the fear of death or anxiety about my mortality, but it doesn't freak me out. And that's thanks to touching something beyond personal consciousness, briefly, fleetingly. And that's, so this no trace continues endlessly. It's an intimation of eternity. If our fundamental nature is the space where the universe is unfolding, and it's devoid of any substance to begin with, what can happen to it? What can happen to so Buddha nature is unborn and undying. That's one of the doctrinal statements about Buddha nature. It's not fabricated, it's non-created, it's eternal. And it's nothing at all, no mind, no Buddha. Mind itself is Buddha, and no mind, no Buddha. So our fundamental nature is unborn, undying, but it's nothing we can actually possess or identify with. We share it with all beings. And if that's more important to us than our little narrative about our personal storyline, somehow working in darkness, attachment to our lifespan lessens considerably. No answers are given as to the nature of birth and death, except that they're two sides of one coin. That they require one another. Without birth, there would be no death, of course. But without death, there'd be no actual life. That somehow the compliment that birth and death, life and death, are in service to one another becomes a false sense. And forgetting ourselves while living is the source of all blessing and all joy, all authentic meaningfulness. So the ultimate letting go of ourselves is less problematic. That's all I can say. That's the strongest spell I can give, our ultimate demise becomes less problematic when we sincerely practice this way and have some experience of the true existence which comes from emptiness, like Sister Flourishing says. When we have some measure of experience with that, through sustained effort at not thinking, then death becomes less problematic. And we can face it with some measure of equanimity, if not enthusiasm. Anyhow, that's my talk for tonight. I hope I didn't bumble on it too much. As I said, this is a core teaching. It's probably it's kind of like the Lord's Prayer of Dogen Zen. Let's put it that way. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by everything. When actualized by everything, the burden of being a person drops away. No trace, you don't get anything out of it, but this freedom of not having to get anything continues endlessly. So, like I say, it's the Lord's Prayer of Dogen Zen, Dogen's teaching. So, have a good night, and thank you very much.